Discernment lesson number 1, you must encounter Christ. Can you see my breath? Okay, first one. I'm excited for this because it's the beginning of a serious journey. Hopefully you got to watch the first introduction to this series on if Jesus is calling you to be a Catholic priest. And we're going through 10 discernment lessons or discernment principles. And this is the first one. Pay attention throughout this whole time to your feelings. I know it might sound weird. Or maybe not. I mean, I don't think it sounds weird. Oh, man, am I going to see my breath this whole video? Can you guys? I don't know if you can see it. Stay focused. Pay attention to your feelings. What's going on inside your heart? What is going on inside of me? Listen to those moments of fear. Listen to those moments of anxiety, of conflict, of joy, of peace. All those things you got to pay attention to, because if you're not aware, it's going to be hard to discern. You got to really start to internalize the events that are happening into your life and try and discover their meaning, because that is God speaking to you in many different ways throughout your day. So grow in a capacity for awareness, and this comes with practice by just choosing to be alert and taking note. Like if you got a journal, those moments when you felt a lot of joy, those moments when you had peace, and where were you when you had peace? What was going on? What were you contemplating or meditating on? Because you can't just learn from exposure to things. You need to actually reflect on it, and then ideally write about it so you can get what's in your mind and your thoughts out onto paper so it can become more reality. There's this one quote by T.S. Eliot: "We have experienced but missed the meaning because we did not stop and reflect on it." You need to stop and reflect. And so this is why in the description of each of these lesson videos, I'm going to have questions to answer. I'm going to also have additional material that would be relevant to this video that has been helpful for me that I'm going to add there, so you can have additional things to watch and listen to, questions to answer, and then I'm going to add in, because why not, a good challenge. So go to the description and make sure to answer those questions. Journal them out. Because it's so important to reflect on your life, what is happening, because God is speaking to you in every moment of the day. And at the end of the day, to do an examine and look back on your day and where God was speaking to you, what happened in your day, what God was maybe showing to you through that, and then be willing to engage in spiritual direction. If you don't have a spiritual director, try and find one, or at least have somebody to share these things with, so they can have an objective view of kind of what's going on in your life, and maybe just give you some encouragement or affirm certain things that you think the Lord may be saying to you, and they can at least give you some affirmation and be like, I think that maybe the Lord, or you're not crazy thinking that, because it's easy to get in our own mind, and we're not meant to discern alone. So I highly encourage you to get a spiritual director. And I'm speaking to myself on this one too, because I got to get better at this, because we're on this journey together. I got to work on the spiritual direction part. I mean, we'll not get into that. Here we got the discernment booklet. Okay, principle number 1, you must encounter Christ. When Pope Benedict was speaking to some seminarians in Germany in 2005, he said, A seminarian experiences the beauty of God's call in a moment of grace which could be defined as falling in love. It is only when a young man has had a personal experience of Christ that he can truly understand the Lord's will and consequently his own vocation. One of my favorite quotes from this entire booklet that it starts off with is that discovering one's vocation is not about a navel-gazing, self-focused, psychological exercise. It's not about a man figuring something out. It's not about solving a confusing puzzle. For me, that's a huge weight off my shoulders when I think, okay, this is not about me just figuring it out. It's about encountering a person, Jesus Christ. That's ultimately what discovering one's vocation is about. It comes from encountering Jesus and then being moved by his love to want to serve him, to want to just serve him with joy. Because it's when we encounter Christ that he reveals our vocation to us. It's a call, right? Vocation is a call, and it's a call from who? From Jesus. So we need to encounter him, his living presence, and encounter him in prayer to hear what he's calling us to do. It's easy, and I fall into this a lot. It's like I get caught up in measuring myself based on a righteousness from the law, like St. Paul talks about in Philippians, where I judge myself based on how well I'm acting out certain Catholic practices or Catholic actions. And all those things are really good, but they're not meant to just assure me that I'm living out my faith. But at the heart of it, it's meant to be a relationship and journey with a person who's Jesus. And he calls us to specific things because he knows each of us by name. He knows our hearts. He knows our desires, our gifts, our talents, our struggles. He knows the ways we need to grow. So if we're not in touch with this relationship with Jesus and having a deep and intimate friendship with him, then it's going to be really hard to know what he's calling us to do. And that's a special thing to realize, is that we each have a specific call. Because saying yes to vocation is freely responding to God's love. That's what it really is at the heart of it, is freely responding to God's love. And when we encounter this love, we just want to explode and just serve God, to give our lives to God. And so it shouldn't be something we're afraid of. And I'm really excited because this episode I interviewed Bishop Mark Hagemoen. I'm really, really grateful that he gave me the time to share some of his story with us. And so I took a piece of that interview. If you'd like to listen to the whole interview, I will upload it to the Disciples on a Mission podcast. But really pay attention to this segment. It's about 12 minutes. And Bishop shares this moment of encounter he had with Jesus in the Gospels on this trip around the world he was going on, or just before. And this moment doesn't explain his whole life. And in the entire interview, he shares about his past a little more, where his times growing up encountering Christ. That was cool, him sharing those stories. Sadly, guys, the video cut out for the majority of this section of the interview. So just hang in there to the end of the video and just listen to the audio. Really pay attention to this engaging way that Christ was drawing Bishop Mark to himself. He's about to go on this trip. He's really excited for it. But then something happens on this trip that changes his direction.
So
this geology was all before your trip?
This was all before the trip.
Oh so yeah. You still had that trip in mind. It was just like...
Oh yeah, that trip was huge.
Were you having hopes of like what you were going to find throughout the trip, or answers to questions?
I had all sorts of answers. I wanted to see other countries, other cultures, other faiths. Wanted to see all of that.
Huh. Okay.
It was on my heart like crazy. It was not going to happen.
So then you went.
So after, I graduated from UBC. I worked for almost a year. And then I had just enough money, $7,000, which I calculated would pay for almost everything, working along the way and so forth. And I went in 1984. I went from January of 1984 and returned in December of 1984. So something happened on the trip that I'll just sort of summarize. Is I started the trip and I got a nice cheap Korean Airlines ticket, and I could get to through LA to Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then Bangkok. Wow. And so I started the trip, And out of nowhere, this voice, you've heard this,
Yeah.
this voice kept just calmly saying, priesthood, priesthood. And so I heard it, and it kind of got me a little rattled. Priesthood, priesthood. Check out the priesthood. And so I started praying to God. I said, okay, God, something's putting this on my heart, probably you. So, when I get home, I'll check out the priesthood. I'm going to enjoy this year now that you've placed before me, and I know you want me to do this. Priesthood, priesthood. It wouldn't go away. And so I started to get mad after a while because it was driving me crazy. And I finally made a deal with God. I said, okay, God, I promise you that when I get home at the end of the year, I will go to Archbishop Carney, my Archbishop, and I will talk to him about seminary. He might not accept me, Lord, but I will do this. Instant peace. Instant peace. And I didn't have a lot of spiritual kind of wisdom or direction, but I knew enough about peace that it was some sort of affirmation that this was a right thing, a right decision. So yeah, as soon as I said, okay, Lord, I give up. I promise you when I return from my trip, I will pursue at least checking out the priesthood. Instant peace for the rest of the trip. It just then I was almost like free to enjoy the rest of the trip. But then the next issue came up. And again, I was working through Southeast Asia, and I went into mainland China for about 3 or 4 weeks. I didn't go to Peking or what was the other? Anyway, the other big city. I went right into the interior mainland. I wanted to see where, the country people lived, and so it was a tough trip. It was a tough trip. I took bus and a lot of train. I got sick, the worst sick of my life. I got sick, but after that, it took me a while to recover. I had guts of steel for the rest of the trip. Anyway,
And you still have them. And
I'm working on it, but yeah. So the question then kept coming up. Is like, do you know Christ? And I was like, okay, So back to university. One of the things that hit me between the eyes is that I looked at the major political hero leaders of the 20th century. Um, World War I, World War II, of those times, and other leaders that try to sort of mitigate against the conflict, you know, um, and without naming names of any sort of hero versus villain, it was like there was no one person that seemed to have either the personal way or the personal or political philosophy to kind of answer the kind of questions that would kind of deal with the complexity of problems in the world. And I remember political science, and again, I was young and naive and idealistic. And I remember a political theory course. What is the moral imperative for a nation state? And the key answer that came up is the moral imperative for a nation state is whatever will fulfill its self-interest and survival as a nation state. Which sounds kind of obvious and commonsensical, but it was like, no, I cannot accept that. That is just too utilitarian and limited to kind of really track us to a solution to the flourishing of the world, and let alone dealing with kind of the complexity of conflicting political agendas. And again, I was idealistic, but so all of that's in the back of my mind, is looking for a way that would help me answer these and other questions that had come up in my humanities training at UBC. So then the issue is, well, Mark, are you going to continue to be a Catholic or not? You can't be a priest unless you're really convinced to being a Catholic and a Christian. And that just came upon my consciousness, and came up in my prayer, such as it was. And so I knew exactly what to do. I had to look at the big guy, and the big guy was Jesus. And I knew enough in my Catholic sort of schooling that if you wanted to learn about the life of Jesus, there were 4 Gospels in the New Testament. So I knew I'm not going to read all 4. I'm going to read one. And so I chose Mark. Mark, because that's my name, and even more to the point, I knew it was the shortest gospel. So I was in the Philippines at the time, and I bought a Bible for $1.65 US. And
it was English?
And it was English, and it was a hardcover.
Huh.
And I read the Gospel of Mark from cover to cover. And, I'd heard all sorts of gospel stories before in the life of Jesus, but given where I was in my life and given what I was searching for and given really the yearning of my heart as well as my head, um, golly, the person of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark came alive. So uh, I would describe the person of Jesus here was the ultimate non-hypocrite. Why did I pick that word? Because it seemed that, so many figures in history, there was some sort of limitation or failure, or unfortunately, even hypocrisy. And there was absolutely none of that in the way of Jesus. It was, he was a man for others all the way. He spoke for the benefit and to hold up others. He healed, whether it was physical or emotional or human. When I may say human, comforting those who were afflicted or lonely. He was able to retort argumentatively extremely well and not take that any further to a self-advantage. And then, of course, the thing that blows everyone away, blew me away, was seeing the Passion Week and the crucifixion of Christ in a full new way. It was like, this guy really did go where no one has gone before. Who could do that with an awareness that he was the Son of God, and yet that did not stop him from taking it all. It was like, wow, and yeah, it was like, this is the answer. This is the answer. This way, this person is the answer. So, I mean, I don't know if it was less. I don't know if it was more about knowing Jesus as an answer to the problems of political human history, or knowing him personally. I think it was both, and it kind of set me forward to build a personal relationship with the Lord. But that was a profound meeting for me, reading and beholding Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And then the rest of the trip around the world kind of built on that. I mean, for example, I went to Israel for 2.5 months, worked on a kibbutz, which is a kind of a social, communal kind of Jewish community that there were many of these set up after the Second World War, when just, Israeli or Jewish people all over parts of Europe came to the newly created state of Israel in 1948. So I went to a place called Mayan Baruch, which was right on the northeast finger, right below Mount Hagemoen. And, what had started by sort of reading the Gospel of Mark kind of brought me to an acute awareness, I think, of the Holy Land came alive. It came alive. Now, I knew enough about the Holy Land from my Catholic formation and training and historical, but, encountering the Lord in that personal way a few months previous, and then to be able to go to the place of his life and birth and life, wow, that was powerful. And I worked enough time to be able to go to Jerusalem for Holy Week and Easter. That was very powerful. I don't say this to very many, and I'm not sure how widespread this video is going to be, but because of that experience, Israel and Jerusalem mean a lot more to me than even Rome does. I love Rome, and I've had some great powerful visits to Rome, especially as a bishop. But there was nothing in my life experience like going to the Holy Land. Yeah.
So all within this trip, then, still, at that point, you had in your mind kind of throughout the trip more priesthood and like discerning these. Am I going to kind of go in this direction, especially when I get back from my trip? So you'd kind of stop thinking about marriage at that point, or what? Like,
no, I hadn't stopped thinking about marriage. Remember, I said I'd check out the priesthood. The decision wasn't there. I didn't make the decision for priesthood until the very last year at seminary, just before my deacon year. Yeah. So
throughout the whole time in seminary.
Oh yeah, I was still discerning. I was, like I remember going to seminary. I kept my cards close. It was like, I'll check this out. And I was, first of all, I had my back up against what kind of academic work and study I'm going to get. And if I'm going to have stuff shoved down my throat and I have to believe it, my back was up. It was.
Yeah.
So I did the makeup year in philosophy because I didn't have a philosophy undergraduate degree. So I was kind of quite surprised. This philosophy is pretty good. It stands on its own feet, and it gives you the tools to think, and I like that. I really received that well. And then when I started to study theology, I didn't expect this. It's building on my philosophical training. And it's kind of providing a framework and a basis for me to see and come at some of the difficult questions that had come up in my humanities training that were not getting answered, or were not, at least a pathway wasn't clear about how to solve them. When I say solve them, I mean to find a way of learning from the best and the worst of human history to a vision and a future of not just hope, but hope is really important, but that hope and that vision affects how we live now. You know, and theology did that for me. I loved I hadn't really been exposed much, a bit little less to the church's moral teaching, but her social teaching. Oh, that really fired me up.
Hmm.
And the moral and the social teaching go hand in hand. You can't emphasize one at the expense of the other. They go hand in hand. So I like that. It kind of really spoke to me. I also liked the opportunity to get into biblical history, and to study the Old and New Testament. I love that. And maybe in hindsight, the experience of the Holy Land, albeit a short one, and being on the kibbutz, kind of brought closer to my awareness, the physical places and some of the stories, if you can put, the biblical stories of what happened on the land, through my experience just a couple of years previous traveling.
Hmm.
Um,
And then I guess also like, so you read the Gospels in contrast during that time. Like, who were you contrasting Jesus to in terms of other figures?
Well, the obvious one would be, this is extreme opposite, looking at the Stalins and the Adolf Hitlers, and it was like, how can someone with these guys who are so gifted, I mean, and I'll pick on Adolf Hitler if I might, but such a gifted statesman and people motivator, what happened in him that would shift? And so that's kind of one extreme one. But even the Chamberlain, and then Churchill, Winston Churchill came after Chamberlain, and Chamberlain was the kind of the strategy of appeasement. England tried to avoid war, the Second World War, just after coming off the First, and appeasement didn't work. And kind of one of the strong lessons in hindsight that seemed to be coming out of my courses is that the strategy of appeasement doesn't work with a certain kind of tyrant political leader, and so then you bring on a Churchill, and at least from the English experience. But even in the comparison and contracts, I don't know what a Jesus Christ, what he, well, to say if he had been in Churchill's shoes, what would he have done?
Yeah.
He wasn't, and yet he is all man. He's a person that's all things to all people. But we also got to remember he went to the cross over it. I mean, the other absurd part of the gospel that all this comes to a head is if your enemy strikes you, turn and give him the other cheek. If someone steals your shirt, give him your cloak as well. I mean, that one still confounds me. I must confess sometimes I understand the Old Testament approach to justice better than the New Testament. And I'm working on my ongoing conversion because I'm still on that journey. But I think the crucifixion was the response to all wars and all the worst and ugliest parts of human history. I mean, that's why St. Paul, in one of my favorite passages, Philippians 2:6-11, although he was in the form of God, he didn't exploit it. Rather, he emptied himself, and being like one of us, he went further to be a servant, a slave of humanity. And at a time when he was most abandoned and alone and despised, he poured out his life. I mean, that's just absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
It is. And yet, that is the way that saved the world. So is that a historical learning, or is that a theological learning, or is that a philosophy? I think it's all of that and more. And I don't pretend to have it all figured out, but there's the person of Christ speaking to me that now I give my life to, in my imperfect way.
Where have you encountered Christ? Where has Jesus been in your life. Jesus is alive and real, and he wants to enter into our lives. Whoever wants to be a friend of Jesus and become his authentic disciple, be it a seminarian, priest, religious, or layperson, must cultivate an intimate friendship with him in meditation and prayer. Prayer is essential, guys. Prayer, as the Catechism says, it's not just like something that's good for our relationship with Christ. Prayer is our relationship with Christ. And so, spend time in prayer. Go to visit Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. I invite you, read the Gospels, start to know who Jesus is. Who was this Jesus guy? Get really curious about it. It says here in John chapter 13, Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And that's true. We could see that on the cross. He loved them right to the end. And I do believe that Jesus died for me and for you so that we may be freed from sin and death. Open up your heart as best you can to receive this love. Just realize that you are worth dying for. Jesus literally, he proves that. He doesn't just say it, but he proves it by willing to suffer and die. I know you're alive watching this right now. And God, he grants us our every single breath because he desires us. He thinks it's good we exist. He delights in our life, that we're alive. I mean, it's pretty clear that I can see my every breath right now. So surrender yourself to this love. I truly believe it's the greatest thing you can do for yourself and for others is to truly receive this love. Because it is only in this perfect love of Jesus where you can become fearless. And this is where vocation comes. Is when you're in that moment of total freedom, you aren't afraid because you know that the love of Christ conquers all, and you can say yes. So do not be afraid and stand in the love of Jesus. Okay, make sure to do the challenge. Make sure to answer the questions. If you really want to get fruit out of this, then do the work. Pray with the questions. Spend time in prayer and come to the next video. Watch it. I will see you in the next video. Continue glorifying God with your life and serving Christ our King with joy. Peace, brothers.